I'm always fascinated by how a composer decides or is drawn to creating music and writing those circles and lines on paper. How did it happen for you?
Actually, my first entrance into music is pretty, I mean, I've spoken about it quite a bit. It came through text. It came through the idea of actually just sort of taking poetry and hearing the music to the words in my head, and then setting the music. And I was fortunate enough really early on to have been able to sort of set poetry to music, starting when I was 7, and show it to composers who had done it their whole lives, like Ned Rorem, like Giancarlo Menotti, and receive, overwhelming encouragement for pretty bad work. Mm-hmm. But I think that the fact that I was 7 made it seem, adorable in a way that I had done this. So I got pushed and propelled forward through my setting of text, and then it sort of widened and deepened immensely, actually, the sort of relationship to words and music widened and deepened because of the amount of time that I spent in the theater, because of the amount of time that I spent singing and acting and dancing. And movement actually brought me closer to music as well. So, 10 years of ballet, 7 years of modern dance brought me really close to music. And that's why, even when I write abstract music today, that, so-called abstract music, no music is abstract music, that's pretentious, but even when I write purely instrumental music today that has a theme, like, for example, the string quartet, the Named Angels, the comment that I always get is that begs for dramatization, or it begs to be danced to, or it begs to be. So I think that my entrance into music sort of came through encircling music, and primarily through drama and dramaturgy. Yeah.
How much did the early traveling that you did as a teenager to different countries inform your music, as well as all the things you did before that?
I think it always has an indelible imprint on who you are when you travel, and when you grow up in those circumstances. The thing about traveling isn't just that you get exposed to a lot of different cultural elements. I mean, there's a lot of thought about what it means to be a sort of military brat, and there isn't so much thought, I think, about what it means to be a foreign service brat. I don't think that there's when your parents are diplomats, whether you're talking about ambassadors or consul generals or medical attaches, you're talking about a situation where you're always moving around and you're forced to make friends.
Yeah.
And you make friends, and I'm almost 30 years old, I hate to admit, and so this is still the pre-internet, pre-Facebook era. So when you make friends, and then you move, and then you make new friends, and then you move and you make new friends, and it influences the way that you form relationships. Mm-hmm. And as a result of this, it's an added challenge for a young person going through this sort of social upheaval every few years and having to do this. But then, having been, in the last decade or so, having our society having been transformed by social media and by the internet and by increasing advancements in travel everywhere except the United States, you find that you actually, the net result is that you have friends all over the world. And you keep hearing their perspectives, and you keep hearing the perspectives of the different voices that are coming from all over. So yeah, the cosmopolitan outlook, I think, is very, very important. I don't think it can necessarily be overstated, because in the end, my voice as a composer is very distinctly a Middle Eastern, my own voice, and distinctly a Middle Eastern and an American voice. And again, whether it epitomizes the stories that we tell in a culture such as ours here in the States, or the mythologies and the stories of the Middle East, it's always present in my work. So that's something, the storytelling element. Whether it's Gabriel and Michael and Israfel and King David and Solomon or Porgy and Bess, it's very much part of my dual identity. But having said that, yes, it will influence the way that I approach an instrument like the violin, or an instrument like the flute, for that matter. These instruments that go back thousands of years in the Middle East. About a month ago, I was preparing for this premiere of this Wallace Stevens set. And the final song, it's for countertenor and flute. It's the weirdest possible combination, ethereal, everything above middle C, everything in the heavens. And the final song of says the setting of the poem Domination of Black, which is a very dark poem by Stevens. I mean, it's essentially a poem, in my reading, essentially a poem about suicide. And it progresses like a miniature horror story, the leaves turning in the wind and beauty. And I had this idea that the flute should start in the very upper range and sort of work its way down in a sort of 3-minute long soliloquy right to the bottom of the range, right? Like a sort of like Tchaikovsky has that architecture in the Pathétique that just goes from the highest note to the lowest note, that mourning sort of idea. And then I listened to it, and then I tried it. And then I tried it in the lower octave. And then I sent it to Claire Chase in the lower octave, and I said, please, try this. And I don't know why, but there was something that day, my heart was aching. And she sent me a recording with her, that she took with her iPhone, and I said, I think you found the right octave for this. And it was uplifting. Painful, but uplifting. Like Rumi says, pain is pain, the wounds are where the light comes in. But at the same time, that thought, I don't think would not have appealed to me without the idea of the ney, which is the Arabic flute. And the ney, I was just so, I mean, again, it's a very interesting cultural question, because one thinks about this, largely exists in that lower octave of the flute, which is just so gorgeous and so airy. And so when you listen to Brahms, it uses that octave fairly sparingly. One more example, just coming back to the musical theater, is how does Stephen Sondheim begin Pacific Overtures with that shakuhachi sound, and then infect it over the course of the music as feudal Japan opens up with the sounds of the Western instruments, with the Western instrumental techniques. It's kind of an interesting question. I mean, we overthink these things, but it's not as West-East, sort of clear-cut as all that. It's much more of a mess than a prefix meal.
And Mama, you mentioned earlier about meeting all sorts of different kinds of people throughout your travels. And as Noted Endeavors is really about trying to help other musicians find ways to push their careers forward and become better musicians and performers themselves. One question that brings to mind is I find that you're such a skillful networker. And I was wondering if you had any advice or tips or suggestions on how you are able to network, how you're able to manage such a huge worldwide net of friends that you have.
That's a pretty great question. Unfortunately, we have a situation in the arts today, especially with composers. I think especially with composers and singers, actually, because they're the two. Is where everyone thinks that they can compose, just like everyone thinks that they can sing. But you fall flat when you try to pretend you can play the violin and then you pick it up.
There's no hiding.
It's a little bit. So I get this question a lot. How do you sort of advance? So when I go to a summer festival or even a sort of top level conservatory to give a master class, I see composition students, usually way too many, first of all, tens of composition students, right? Some graduate students, some older than me, on the doctoral level or whatever. And the young ones inevitably have the question. I think the older ones, if you're 35 and getting a doctorate, you've made a decision. This is the course of your career. I mean, you're going to be an academic, more or less. But I think that for the younger ones who want that sort of career advice, they ask about it. And so what I have been confronted with is 17, 18, 19-year-old composers. I go to give a master class and they say, what tips do you have for my website? Should I use SoundCloud as a way of uploading my music? Is Rebecca Davis a good publicist? Is Stephen Swartz a good publicist? I mean, they know the names of the publicists who are doing the rounds. Is 21C Media Group any good? They know Albert Imperato's name, right?
Right.
They've done their research.
and they're 17, 18, 19. Do you like Pure Music as a publisher? Do you like Schott as a publisher? I mean, it's really interesting. And so, and these are all insider industry questions, right? Should I be managed by IMG? How's James to deal with? Is Opus 3 any better than IMG? I mean, it's like, and you get these questions from the freshmen and the sophomores. And you can't help but think that, I'm only just done looking at your score. And you have a long way to go before you start asking these questions. To be perfectly crass, I wish that you would concentrate on writing a great melody. I wish you would concentrate on your counterpoint. Your counterpoint isn't good and you're asking about Albert Imperato. It's, you're not yet at the point with your technique that you can just stop thinking about technique and express yourself and let your soul sing through your music and not think about, oh my goodness, is this fugue working? But think about, wow, we can just go wild and make that fugue fly, right? Not only are they far from developing a unique personal voice, they're also far from developing even technical competence, right? If you don't have a unique personal voice, something to offer that nobody else can offer, a dramatic vision, a vision of storytelling, then forget about it. It's a complicated and competitive industry, right? What you're talking about as a young composer is actually opening up a store across the street, an independent store across the street from Macy's. Mm-hmm. Let's just say Macy's is like Bach or something, right? All the performers are going to Macy's, right, to buy their music. But you have to have something unique to offer too. You will not survive. Don't talk about opening a store without having the goods in the store, or without having goods that people want to buy. And the last thing I would add to that is, yes, all those people in the industry, these industry insider questions, are wonderful people. But if you don't have a unique story to tell, the press isn't stupid. If you don't have a unique story to tell, if you don't write interesting pieces, Rebecca's not going to manage to get Rolling Stone to write about you. You know, you're not going to become famous just because you have a publicist. You're not going to get gigs just because you have a manager, and your music is not going to sell just because you have a publisher. Those are all means to an end after you develop something. So I think we need to start much later, thinking about these things much later.
Absolutely, but I think there is a kind of anxiety among young artists, no matter what area that they are in which they're feeling there's no place for me. How am I going to make my own opportunities? Because that's what they're told. You have to make your own opportunity. What would you say to young composers who are developing and who don't have that knack for networking the way some do? What is the best way for a young composer to not only hone his own craft, but also make a place for himself?
If you've made your own craft and you have something interesting to say, mm-hmm. then develop the ability to network, even if you're not adept at it.
And how do you go about doing that?
Watch that wonderful number from Sunday in the Park with George called "Art Isn't Easy," where it's just the most for George, it's the most sort of painful, torturous thing, that he's going around talking with these people. And some of these people are like that guy from Texas who doesn't know what the hell he's talking about, right? It's a matter of showing up and being honest, being true to yourself. You have to be true to yourself. I really don't have too many funders or commissioners that are not involved deeply with what I do.
Did you know them first before you went to them and said, I would love to have a commission from you, or can you help me? How does that process work?
One is usually approached mm-hmm. on the institutional level or on the individual level. One is usually approached with people who have an agenda, and then you need to sort of figure out whether the agenda jives with what you want to do. Right.
You mean that someone comes to you and says, I would like you to write a piece for this trio, and you want to think about it before?
Or, for example, somebody comes and says, as recently happened, one good example is that the Voxare Quartet gave a performance
at the Domena Center.
At the Domena Center,
yes.
Right. And old friend of mine came with me, a patron of mine, and was so blown away with their performance of the Named Angels that he immediately wanted to commission something for them and asked me if I would do this. And I said, yes, but, let's figure out the timeline, a couple of years, and then mm-hmm. we'll do that. But, in principle, yes. I mean, I think there needs to be a confluence of inspiration and aspiration and the mindset that is necessary for commissioning music, which is a fundamental belief in the future of the art form and the future of humanity. Commissioning music is one of the most optimistic things that a person can do. Because when you're doing that, you're basically saying, I believe in the creative force of human nature.
The process itself of writing music or writing words or writing a play, etc., is so solitary. And chamber musicians or orchestral musicians have a platform in which they can interact more easily with more people. For a shy but very gifted composer, is it very difficult? How do they get out there and make themselves known?
I wouldn't know because I actually am not very shy. But for a shy and very gifted composer, yes. I mean, I wish them very well.
Okay, let's take the opposite. A brash, very confident composer who wants to say, I've written this and it deserves to be played. I mean, not that they would say that.
I think we see an abundance in this industry of brash people who are not gifted and have nothing to offer. Who go around saying, play this because it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. I think whenever anyone comes and says, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, this is reason for suspicion. Mm-hmm. And yet you do need a certain level of self-esteem, I think. You do need a certain level of self-belief. I was just, Stephen Sondheim was just saying how badly he felt about his lyrics for West Side Story. How he thought that those were not up to par. That's ridiculous. I mean, that of course they're up to par. Of course they're brilliant. But I mean, they were the work of a young man who grew a lot after that. But they still do carry the trait of genius. So yeah, you do need a certain self-belief and self-confidence, and but you also need to let the work speak for itself on some level, because what we do as musicians, as composers, as performers, as writers, novelists, whatever, is so fundamentally different than, let's say, philosophy. Because it can't be theoretical. After a certain point, it's a show-me art form. After a certain point, you're going to have to be able to put it up on stage and see if it flies. And and I had the most interesting comment from a young composer, a very young composer in Indianapolis recently, whom I didn't know, and he came to the premiere of my oratorio with the symphony, Indianapolis Symphony. Came to me afterwards and he said the weirdest things. You always get the weirdest comments from young composers. He says, wow, that really sounded like you knew how it was going to sound when you wrote it. And I said, there are 600 people on that stage. There's a huge chorus, there's a children's choir, and there's the full orchestra. And the whole orchestra, it's all Union Ray. Right? If I didn't know how it was going to sound when it was going to be thrown, I mean, it's not like, okay, well, this is a hugely expensive procedure, let's throw it on stage and see what happens. Throw it against the wall, see if the opera sticks. After people spend $800,000 on production and set and costumes, and I mean, it's not practical. Of course, what we do is a practical art form. That was one of the things that was so great about Curtis, for example, as a school, is that it was just such a practical environment where you had to compose in order to get through it. It wasn't about, and I never really thrived too heavily with the theoretical. I never really did well in theory, and actually over the years, as I've grown, I've developed to be more and more hostile against it as a set of sort of ill-informed preconceptions.
Your music has been informed by so many things, and I've read that you feel that philosophy and geopolitics take an important part, etc. Plus all of the different kinds of music that you've written. Do these ideas just come to you and you follow them? It's not as if you are planting a garden and you're saying, okay, I think I have to put something there. But with so much going on, and I would assume that a lot of young artists also, young composers have a lot going on, choice is so important for you. Choice of what note, choice of what sound, choice of an overall thing. What would you advise a young artist in terms of how you go about taking ideas and really making something that works?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, first of all, I think that the reason why I ended up going into music is because my father absolutely insisted that I go to the conservatory. So I was torn. I had done a lot of music and I had composed a lot, and I was passionate about it, but I was also very keen on getting on a path and just getting on a path where I would end up in the Kennedy School of Government.
Really? You wanted to follow in that
Oh,
footstep?
sure. And he was absolutely opposed by that. You're going to create too many problems for yourself and the rest of the world, is what he said, if you do this. So you must go into music. And then, of course, I haven't spared the rest of the world any problems now, because I'm, essentially a political writer. I mean, when you're a writer, you can write novels, you can be a playwright, you can be a poet, you can be whatever, you can be an op-ed columnist for the Washington Post. I'm essentially a political writer. I do this through music.
I'm not sure I understand what it means to be a political composer. How does that work? How is it, obviously through sound and words, etc. Can you do it just with sound, or must have text?
You can do it just with sound. I think that one of the things that I've found to be sort of helpful about the purely instrumental idioms, like I'm working on this cello concerto right now for the Detroit Symphony and for Maya Beiser, is that I find that I can comment on religion without being blasphemous. So very much in the same way that, for example, the old Islamic artists avoided figurative and explicit artwork in favor of these beautiful geometric patterns that were abstract. Instrumental music, cello concerto, violin concerto, string quartet, violin sonata, whatever, has that quality for me. Having said that, I'm completely unique, I think, in the world today, in that I am working on three major operas simultaneously, and I can't think of. I'm saying that not as a conceit, but as a way to say that I can't remember the last time that three major opera houses, the Washington National Opera, Pittsburgh, the Dutch National Opera, have actually invested in one composer to create these musical dramas, all at the same time, essentially, over the next 5 seasons. There are these big operas. And the piece for the Dutch National Opera that's premiering first, actually, in 2017, is a 4-act drama with a libretto by David Ignatius, my colleague and friend from Italy, who has always been a great columnist for the Post, who has always been one of our most important foreign affairs correspondents. He's always been the sort of person that the president has to have his column open to on his desk in the morning, see what David's point of view was. But David was in Lebanon during the Civil War, the Lebanese Civil War in the 80s. He went to the American embassy. He met with his friends. He came back from the American embassy to his hotel, heard an explosion, went back, found that all of his friends were dead, and started meeting with people to sort of uncover the story. And as he did this, he found that there was so much classified information that could not be revealed. He couldn't keep it within himself. So he started writing fiction as a way to liberate himself and to tell the deeper truths of reality. I can say anything in fiction, he said, right? So the result was Agents of Innocence, and it was published. It became a New York Times bestseller. And then 11 novels later, he's now writing an opera libretto, which he calls the most liberating way to tell a story, because opera demands that you paint with the largest possible brush, the global brush, right? It demands a level of humanity and sentimentality that you can't write in a novel for modern audiences with modern sensibilities, but if done correctly, can be so politically astute, whether you're painting the characters of Machiavelli and Fortuna as we are, or I would say you could read 100 post-colonial tracts, analytical and theoretical as they are. Or you could go and watch, you can do both, you can certainly do both. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive, and I would encourage people to do both. But then you go and watch Madame Butterfly. And understand how awful the character of Sharpless is. Mm-hmm. And feel for Butterfly, feel for her in that final scene, weep for her. And through the music, through the storytelling, Puccini actually makes this incredible commentary on how screwed up the relationship between the West and Japan really was. And you feel for the characters, they become people, you humanize them. And that's a tremendous gift, I think.
You just had your release on Deutsche Grammophon.
I just gave her a copy.
And
yes.
It was fantastic, but you have quite a few recordings on various labels and with so many different musicians. And I guess the biggest question would be, how do you make those projects happen? So if you could give us some idea of how you come up with the idea and then how you carry it all the way through to be able to hand the finished project to Eugenia.
I hate to say this, but I mean, again, I know that there's a sort of desire for easy answers here, but
well, your answers would be great.
I can't really take the credit for it. I think that much of this has to do with you guys. And that's really, I mean, that's...
You mean us as musicians or performers?
You guys as performers. I mean, it doesn't really matter. I mean, listen, it doesn't really matter what anyone thinks of your music in the so-called elite academic world. If the audiences like it, they'll ask for more. If the performers like it, they will play it, they will record it. And the ultimate test of that, I think, for a composer is the singers. So singers have these incredibly personal instruments, right? And they won't touch anything. And they never have. Even in the high days of academia, they never, God bless them, they never touched anything that was crap for their instrument. And if they approve of you, they will take it everywhere. They will sing it on every recital, they'll sing it on the grand stages, and if you appeal to, if you give them something that they can program with Dishana Miller, if you give Kate Lindsay something that she can program with L'inuitité, or indeed, I mean, even if you give Patti LuPone something that she can program with numbers by Adam Guital and Jason Robert Brown, I mean, she'll do it. They'll do it. So it's really up to you. I mean, it's you guys that make this happen for a composer. I mean, a composer cannot do anything without the buy-in of the performers.
Do you ever work with the performers in finding funding or labels or ways of helping get the CDs out there?
Not really, no. I mean, it's not about working with the performers. It's about having an infrastructure to create something, right? And then we all work together to do it.
Is that infrastructure finding the funding beforehand to make sure that let's say the recording can happen and the venues? Is that what you mean by infrastructure?
So I'm very fortunate in that I turn down a lot of commissions. I earn all of my money on commissions and I get approached all the time. So I'm unfortunately not the right person to ask because I don't go around asking for funding.
Did you ever? Was there a point at which you needed to do that?
Yes. Yeah. And you find people who believe in you. You find people who believe in you. It's much more meaningful. And who are willing to be involved and to stay involved. That's much more meaningful actually in the long run than filling in a DMV type application and getting, some small amount of, $10,000 for a commission or something like that, right? But if you have somebody and people and who believe in this, then yeah, I think that's absolutely.
So then for you, it really comes back to the networking and maintaining contacts and sounds.
Yeah, and even socially inept composers like Beethoven were able to go to Count Lichnowsky and say, look, I have something really special here. So I mean, so people who are perhaps not entirely socially normal, but closer to the socially normal, like I bathe every day, for example, right? So that should be easier for those of us who do that.
So with, you have a performance this evening here at Carnegie Hall. Was that something that, sorry to remind you, but is that, and you've had many before, and we did one not so long ago.
Hall?
It is a great hall.
It's the greatest.
But is that something that you've developed a partnership with Carnegie, or is that, again, from musicians wanting to play your music on this stage?
It's both. It's really both, and you have to develop a relationship. You have to develop relationships with the presenters, and when the presenters like Carnegie Hall or Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center or the Vivian Beaumont Theater or the Roundabout Theater or the Metropolitan Opera come and say, we'd like you to come and talk to donors or give a performance. Or something where you go out and if you've just gotten off the plane from LA that day and you're tired and you're exhausted, you say, I'll be right there. Because you have to understand as a musician, as a composer, as a performer, as a writer, that the survival of these institutions, not just the survival, but the thriving of these institutions is absolutely essential. Your career is mud unless you have the platform to demonstrate it. And it's a mutually supportive ecosystem.
I need to ask you one question, and that is about being controversial. When you take on a subject like the Twin Towers, as you did in the name of the piece is?
In the Shadow of No Towers, yeah.
The Shadow of the Towers. Did you worry at all about controversy of, some jihadist saying this is someone from our part of the world, or, a Middle Eastern person who is taking this on, and has that ever happened?
No, so first of all, I don't really see the jihadists as being from our part of the world. They're everywhere in the world.
They're everywhere, you're right.
And it's a cult mentality that needs to be, it's a cult mentality and an ideology that needs to be destroyed. In fact, the problem is that the jihadists actually the only thing that sort of links them to the Middle East is that they wreak the most havoc in the Middle East, and even in prosperous parts of the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, where we saw an attack on a mosque a few days ago, that so-called ISIS has claimed responsibility for. But I think we need to put this all into perspective. Number one, I think we need to stop calling the jihadists in this particular group Islamic State in the Western media. I think we need to realize that when you attack the land of the two holy mosques itself, and you launch attacks in Saudi Arabia, and then you say that one of your stated goals is the destruction of the great mosque in Mecca, if that's not un-Islamic, I don't know what is. So, and they're also not a state. So let's stop calling them Islamic State. And then the second part of the equation is that if you go further east to where it really is a problem, a bigger problem perhaps in Pakistan, it's not my part of the world necessarily. The thing about the jihadists is that they don't like me anyway. I'm not going to woo them or, whatever. It's not the sort of thing. They're not my friends. What I was surprised by, though, within the Shadow of No Towers is that there were people who were only marginally linked to the September 11th tragedies, who are not New Yorkers, who are not part of this ecosystem where all of us lost someone by second or third degree, who said, people like in Utah or some godforsaken place saying, how disrespectful of him. It's a project that I had done out of an abundance of respect, right? And, the extremists from both sides can, frankly, go eat a brick, because I'm not trying to appease the extremists. Although I do have to say that I'm fascinated by the figures. I'm fascinated by the characters that are driven by fear and hatred, and how similar they are. People like Bin Laden and Dick Cheney. And it's very, very interesting that they're also like Adolf Eichmann, very banal. Very commonplace, very if you go and read the last, the memos, the torture memos that Cheney, and they're very sort of systematic. Or you go and read the last few months of material that Bin Laden had, it's really very mundane, very sophomore. It's like a kid with the Che Guevara poster on his wall, and the Al-Qaeda application forms and things like that. It's absolutely weird. But then you realize that, as Hannah Arendt said, there's a banality to evil. It's not this romanticized, the most fabulous evil people are, Disney villains like Cruella de Vil and Frollo, but they're not like that. They're actually just sort of idiots. And I don't think we need to necessarily appeal to the idiots. I think we need to raise the general level of, and empower the general level of the informed majority.
But you must have been very gratified by the response that piece of music brought.
I was actually gratified by I was gratified by one thing, more than anything else. I was gratified by the fact that when I took the commission, I was told that I was out of my mind for writing something for wind ensemble, a big piece for wind ensemble. And I was told that, forget about the press, forget about the Wall Street Journal, forget about the New York Times. We got all of that, but we also got the first New York Times review for a wind band piece since Persicchetti's Seventh Symphony was premiered.
Wow.
And that is both a point of great pride and at the same time a real tragedy. Because since between the Persichetti and this, you know, John Corigliano's Circus Maximus was premiered. Some very important wind symphonies were premiered. But again, it's about giving them a story, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you write in a notebook when you have ideas or little fragments of ideas?
Yeah, sure. Sure. But I also write my fair scores by hand.
So you don't use a computer?
Don't know how.
That's unusual, isn't it, for
I think
composers
I'm the
now?
only one left, yeah. I think even the old dinosaurs are using computer programs.
But you don't use a feather? You don't write with a feather?
No, I'm all for the rights of birds.
Then you give it to your publisher to put into the
Yeah,
computer.
they engrave
and they do
it and they do all that stuff, yeah. And they actually prefer it because they have an urtext. They actually, you can't just get into this endless argument and no, that was this or that. No, you have the manuscript and it's there.
Is there a way in which the kinetic movement of brain to hand, putting it on paper, feels different for you?
Yeah, of course. I mean, what we do is a contact sport, right? I mean, so it's a physical experience, and I think we do need to. I think it does make sense. It's also slower to put it down pencil to paper, and it takes maybe about 10 to 15 seconds extra per measure. And in the 10 to 15 seconds extra, you might have some bright ideas, you know, like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have the trombones double the violas there. And you save yourself disasters, you know.
How important do you feel it is for young artists to have a representative for public relations? Yes, they have to be very good at what they do, but is it essential?
The reason I have a PR representative is because it would be impossible for me to do anything without a PR representative. Because when you go on a program like Morning Joe or Charlie Rose or whatever, you need to schedule these things, and somebody needs to provide B-roll footage, somebody needs to provide all the materials, someone needs to give Mika Brzezinski a rundown of what to ask in the background, and she has about 2 minutes to take this in, and there's a million different things, and every day you need to be writing music, and you need to be going about your life, and hopefully you have a little bit of a personal life on the side. So, I mean, I can't do it without a PR. Most young composers are not doing an abundance of television and print media, so, you know, it might not be essential.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Cool,
This was
yeah.
great.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Terrific.